I'm Dana Perino, and this is Perino on Politics. Well, the winner takes it all. Donald Trump is now the president-elect and will become the 47th president of the United States. And joining me now for a look at last week's historic results and what it means going forward as we look to advance the ball down the field a little bit is the founder of the Stewart Group. And it's my friend, Don Stewart. We call him Stu. And he is a return guest. And we're grateful to have you on Perino on Politics. This is, of course, the podcast where I call my smart friends and say, what do you think? What happened? And where do we go from here? So, Stu, welcome back.
Oh, great. Thanks for having me. It's going to be fun.
I love talking to you because you have such a steady, even-handed look at things. And what were your top-line takeaways from last week when President Trump had that huge win?
Well, there were a few. One, this was a fairly traditional election when you take the personalities out of it. If you look at the mood of the country, the right track, wrong track, the sour economic point of view for most Americans, the concern about immigration, the top two issues being for the challenger, it was a fairly traditional election. That was the outcome we expected. Of course, this wasn't a traditional election. It wasn't traditional candidates. A million different things happened. But overall, it's kind of what you would expect with this kind of atmospherics in an election, a normal election year.
Do you mean that was because change elections are more common and also because of inflation?
Yeah, I think that's part of it. The mood of the country was really sour. They were not happy with the incumbent. The incumbent had low approval ratings. The wrong track numbers were off the charts. And you had a candidate in Vice President Harris in a change election who failed to embrace change. In fact, she wrapped her arms around the current administration, current policies, said there was nothing really she should change. So I think that combined with the mood of the country brought out the outcome that we got.
Do you think that there was something like you wrote? I know that you wrote down economic nostalgia.
Yeah, sure, there was. I mean, if you look at people, Trump's approval numbers now are higher than when he was in office. Mm-hmm. What people thought about the economy under his administration are higher now than when he was in office. So there is this economic nostalgia, a return to the way things were before the current administration. So there is a longing for that. And I think the country was polarized. Half the country has a deep enmity for Trump, and half the country wants to return to the way things were before COVID, before the current administration, those sorts of things. So there is an economic nostalgia, certainly.
And the Democrats really told themselves that abortion would be the issue that took them across the goal line, and that just didn't materialize.
Yeah, this is probably the first election of the last couple where it wasn't one of the deciding factors. And I think probably the smartest thing that President-elect Trump did early on was to not endorse a federal national ban by saying that it's open to the state. That gave a lot of women who would otherwise before him the ability to vote for him and not say, well, I can't vote for him because he's for a federal ban. So he took that off the table early. And I think that was, of all the things that happened in this race, and there were a lot, I think that was probably among the smartest things that he did and probably the biggest turning point in the election. And
what about the fact that you showed in a little email that I get from you where you look at the polls regularly, you kept pointing out that there was very little movement.
Oh, yeah.
Even when there were big events like a debate or a big news story, like everything was pretty steady all the way through.
Yeah, the only thing that changed in this election, this was a polarized nation. This is as polarized as we ever been. This race was decided probably back in February or March when Trump was pretty clear he'd be the guy. If you look at the polling, Fox News polling right before the debate with Biden, they were tied. This was within the margin of error, this was a tie race. The only thing of all, like you said, there was assassination attempts, debates, you name it. The only thing that changed this was Biden's debate, and that was only temporary. And once there was a replacement candidate, went right back to status quo ante. The race was tied all the way through. She's up a little, he's up a little. But in the end, the result was basically what the pollsters predicted, which was this tie race within the margin of error. His national polling average a victory was about 2.5%, which is within the 3-point margin of error that the pollsters gave us.
I was reading about the Democrats focusing on inequality in the past, right? Mm-hmm. But they have kind of given up on economic inequality. and focused a lot in the last few years on racial and gender inequality. And the fact that they missed out on that economic piece means that President Trump has a new and different coalition where it's much more multiracial, his coalition, than it had been in the past. But the one thing that is clear is that working class voters really preferred his approach.
Yeah, I think the polls were screaming economy and immigration from the beginning. They were screaming it. And I think the current administration just missed that in the campaign. That everybody knew that those were going to be the top two issues all the way through, and they were. And like I said, this being such a polarized nation, the election was largely decided months ago. So people, you either could embrace change and want to have return to economic robustness and do something about the border, or you didn't. And that was the binary choice, and that worked in his favor.
Also, I want you to talk about this a little bit because you note that pollsters weren't really that far off.
Right.
Tell me more.
If you look at the battleground, I think they missed on the non-battleground states. Texas, Florida, Iowa were supposed to be close, and they were blowouts. So they missed there. But the states of consequence, the battleground states, all the pre-election polls had those within the margin of error. They were all tied, some by less than 1%. And that was the outcome. Except for Arizona, Trump won all the battleground states within the margin of error. What they missed was that he would win all of them. Experts say that typically in situations like this, when it's that close, you do win all of them. But he won all of them within the margin of error, except for Arizona, which isn't fully counted yet. So I thought that was remarkable.
One of the things that I was thinking about, because Stu is great on all things politics, but communications is really his forte. And you and I knew each other very well when I was at the White House. And I think about the four things that I would see the White House do over and over again through the White House podium, being the briefing room, and Karine Jean-Pierre, the press secretary. But not just that. It wasn't limited to that. It was also the cabinet. And it was these things. And I say these are basically the four stories the White House told themselves and then tried to convince the American people, which were just not true on its face. The first one was that inflation really wasn't that bad. And if you remember early on, the former chief of staff to Biden said that inflation was a high-class problem, right? I mean, that was astounding. Then they kept saying over and over again from the White House podium and on television, on social media, that the border was secure.
Right.
Secretary Mayorkas of Homeland Security kept saying the border is secure. And they just said that over and over again. To the point that by the time they started saying, well, it was the Republicans and Trump that killed the Senate bill, which is the reason we have a broken border, no one believed them.
Yeah.
The third thing was that crime is down.
Right.
They kept saying, well, look at the statistics. The statistics show that they're down. Well, meantime, in their cities, they're seeing the degradation of basic civic life. And then in some of the rural areas, they were dealing with migrant crime. But the fourth one they tried to pull over on the American people was that Joe Biden was running circles around the staff behind the scenes at the White House.
Right.
I'm like, those are four huge issues. And they were either lying to themselves or telling stories to the American people, but they ultimately had to pay a price for it.
Yeah, I mean, there is a tendency to believe what your consultants, I hate to say that as a consultant, what your consultants are telling you or what you're hearing from your friends. I think there is a whole lot of people who have been radicalized by normalcy and who have gotten out of the bubble and see the reality of what it is, and they can't be told something different. People don't believe, there's the old, who are you going to believe, me or your lying eyes? And I think they fell into that. They fell into that somewhat, the previous administration on Obamacare. There was all these pollsters and consultants who were telling them, no, people really do like it, when in fact they didn't. And there's a tendency for people to do it. People in my profession do that all the time. And it's a huge mistake, and you have to get out of the bubble. D.C. voted 93% Democrat in this last election.
Wow.
Literally 93% Democrat. You got to get out of that bubble.
What about the fact that the Democrats were so much better than Republicans at raising small dollar donations, but was spent the money on ridiculous things? Like, I think it's incredible that Oprah Winfrey, for the first time in her life, decided to endorse a candidate, decided to go to a convention, decided to give a speech, but charged the campaign $1 million for a set rather than just donating that in kind.
Yeah.
And meantime, they're asking people to give their hard-earned dollars to help fund a campaign that raised over $1 billion, had $118 million in the bank on October 16th, and ended the election $20 million in debt. Something is broken on that.
Yeah, I mean, there's the notion that, taking money out of politics will change things, or that having the more money, you can't win. That's not always true. Money certainly helps, and it's certainly you need it in elections, but it doesn't always help, depending on where you spend it as well. I mean, if you're looking at, the old ways of marketing to people are not working anymore. The diffusion of media is so intense now in a way that it wasn't. When I was coming up, you could run an ad on 3 channels and call it a day. Now you can't do that. You have to micro-target the whole way through on every issue.
Interestingly, I was noting today that the most effective ad from the Trump team was the one about transgender issues, in which they said, she is for they, them, he is for you.
Right. I saw that a lot at the end, especially down here in Florida. I saw that quite a little bit. And it was resonating with people that I was around. I would spend a lot of time in places where there were groups of people watching TV at the same time, and people whose political leanings I didn't really know, and listening how they reacted. And that one really hit. It's not that they were anti-trans or anti-anybody. They just, I want people, I can't afford a gallon of milk. Can we focus on that?
Can we focus on that?
Where people were.
Let me ask you for the last question of this segment about the United States Senate, of which you know very well, what it means to have had the wins where they had them, the ones where they came up short, where an incumbent still held on. Like, I still cannot believe that Tammy Baldwin won in Wisconsin. That really surprised me, given Trump's margin there. But what it will mean going forward, how hard that was to get to a majority for the Republicans, and how that really is the final act of Senator Mitch McConnell, who will no longer be the majority leader after, I guess, Wednesday. Right.
But yeah, he won his last press conference, said that one of his main goals was to hand a majority to the new leader, and he's done that. He was out there nonstop. He was out there raising and running and hosting events and attending events. He's just a nonstop guy in a way that has energy beyond anything I could ever hope to have. But it does matter. I mean, you get to set the agenda as leader, as the majority. You get to set the agenda. You get to move nominees through, and you get like Trump's cabinet. There was some discussion about recess appointments or whatever, but Democrats not having the ability to filibuster or outright block nominees will just make that process a lot smoother than it was in 2016, where they really put up blockades. But I think they'll have a much better, especially having Republican leadership now. His own party in the Senate will be able to move his nominees quickly, and there'll be a Supreme Court nominee at some point as well.
Did it surprise you that a couple of the Democrats were able to hold on, like in Wisconsin and Nevada?
Not necessarily. Incumbency is really important in an election, and it matters more than money in some cases. And in 2016, all of our candidates were running ahead of then candidate Trump. In this election, Trump was running ahead of the Senate candidates, particularly the challengers, in almost all the states until the last few weeks where they started to close. Had discussions with a lot of the political folks, and they were seeing the same thing, where in polling, Republican candidates were getting a little closer to his numbers. And I think the final numbers kind of show that. They're pretty close, but not enough. So in places like Michigan and Wisconsin, really close, really, really close. But
Michigan, 0.3%.
Yeah, it's super tiny. And it could be people voting for Trump and going home and not voting all the way down the ballot, which is a big problem. So I think the fact that they closed, the numbers were big. I did not expect 53, but I was hoping for 53. 53 is a really good number, because then also you don't have to rely on every single member. When you only have 51 or 50, every single member of the Senate has veto power.
Yeah.
So if you're a leader, that's really frustrating. Have 53, you can lose a couple and still hang in there.
Do you have an opinion on who should be the majority leader after this fight between Cornyn, Thune, and Rick Scott? I know, of course, you used to work for Cornyn.
I did. I've worked with Senator Thune, and I worked with Senator Scott when he first came up to the Senate. They're going to pick a good majority leader, and that majority leader is going to do a great job.
All right. We'll have more Perino on Politics coming right up. And we're back with Perino on Politics, and Don Stewart is my guest. Stu, can you look ahead a little bit, the Democrats are just basically in disarray, right? So I don't know where they land, but every loss presents an opportunity to do that. And how do you see all that playing out?
Well, typically after an election like this, the party that lost does a autopsy. And what they usually find is that we weren't liberal enough or we weren't conservative enough. Like we had the right policy and we had the right agenda, we just didn't do it enough, which is usually wrong. And I think that there's already some of that coming out of the party. Bernie Sanders, Senator Sanders saying, the Democrats aren't focusing enough. We need to be more to the left. I think you'll see a lot of that. And I think you'll see people who are vying to be the next presidential candidate will be coming out of the woodworks early and talking about how we need to have a more progressive agenda. I think you'll see a lot of that. But as far as the blocking and tackling in Congress, I think it'll be a lot of obstruction. I think that's what they'll do. The Republicans have done that in the past as well, so it's not unique. But I think their aim will be to fight the president at every step and try to block everything possible to show that they're tough and that we need to return to Democrat policies.
One of the things that you witnessed was Barack Obama was a junior senator from Illinois who rose up to become president after just 2 years in the Senate.
Yeah.
But he was a personality and a generational candidate.
Right.
Donald Trump is a personality and an intergenerational candidate. And I don't see, it's hard for me to see right now who on the Democratic side might have that kind of character in order to pull off some sort of a leadership switch.
Yeah, I don't know who it'll be. I mean, on either party, frankly. I mean, Republicans aren't going to have Trump on the ballot. Not technically anyway. I'm sure he'll still be involved and out there. So they won't necessarily have the same MAGA energy, the same coalition, depending on who Republicans put up 4 years from now. And conversely, Democrats won't have Trump on the ballot to kick around. So they'll have to maybe focus more on policy and what their vision for the country is instead of this being a referendum election. The next election could very well be on actual policy, which would be fascinating. So we'll see if they do that, if both sides do that. But I don't expect we're going to go back to a pre-Trump normalcy in elections where, just a sort of a quote unquote normal election with policy at the forefront. I think the country is way too polarized. I think, I said at the time that Obama was the most polarizing president in history until the next one. It just every president since him has been more polarizing than the next. And I think that will continue. And if you look at, like I said, this election was decided early on. The country is just that polarized.
One of the first things I'll have to do is to staff the cabinet and also the appointees. So there will be that. But I think with 53 senators, it's going to be pretty easy to confirm the nominees and get them through. But the other big issue is going to be the Trump tax cuts. How do you see that fight going? Will that be easier? I think it'll be easier, but it will be easy.
No, nothing's easy. And I think even with having 53 senators makes it easier to move nominees through, especially without a filibuster. But it doesn't mean that he can put up any candidate he wants. There's still senators who will be opposed to really, really radical or unqualified nominees. So I think he'll stay largely within the new mainstream, however you define that. And then the policy and staffing the cabinet. The cabinet's typically done fairly quickly, but there's thousands of other places he has to fill around the country. So that'll take much longer.
All right. We are going to have a little bit more of Perino on Politics coming right up. And we're back with Perino on Politics for our third and final segment. And Stu, I always ask here, what are we missing? What are you thinking about that could be a surprise or that you're paying attention to that the layman over here would not notice?
Well, I think there's a couple. I think one is just sort of a fun one. I think the Democrats who have been calling for ending the filibuster on legislation and being able to just ram things through and calling for packing the Supreme Court with a bunch of new candidates, I think that will go away. I think suddenly those calls will go silent. But the bigger, broader thing I'm looking at for the next election is the post-COVID flight and what that means for both red and blue states. When you have people who have the ability to work where they want to work, remote workers, the flight to other states to red states and bolstering red states and what sort of purple states, what that means for them if you have people leaving New Jersey, New York, LA, whatever, DC, like me, and going to states where they have where they'd like to live and want to live, and what that's going to mean in incoming elections where you have that broad swath of people who are able to leave places they don't like or places where they don't agree with the politics. And does that increase polarization? I think it does. People are able to live where the people around them and their elected leadership agree with them, and moving to that instead of hoping for it, I think will just increase polarization. I think the next election will be just as, if not more, polarizing.
I've been giving a lot of thought to something that I know is on your mind as well, and that is how people are getting their information now.
Yeah.
And even for myself, I still love traditional news. I like cable news. I like network news. I really love Instagram and TikTok, though I don't get news there. But I listen to a ton of podcasts, and mostly current event news kind of podcast. What do you think about that in terms of, is that a good way to look at this? Or are people still like really feeding themselves the same information over and over inside media bubbles?
No, I think people gravitate now more than ever to someone who agrees with them and things that they like. And fewer and fewer people are checking or reading another source and finding out about it. I do think with the diffusion of media that I said before, there's more and more options. Some people are gravitating towards things they like. I do know that TikTok and Twitter, I hear people tell me all the time, they'll say, well, I heard such and such. I say, well, where'd you read that? And they say, oh, I heard it on TikTok. But who on TikTok? Like anybody, a friend of mine says the problem with Twitter is that everybody believes their opinion matters. And so you have a lot of people putting out a lot of information, some of it wrong, some of it right, but it's certainly all slanted and doesn't tell the whole story. And I think that's a real danger, to listen to just people who agree with you.
Yeah, it is not a good thing. And I don't know, in a post-election format, a post-election mood, the form that it took for me was very interesting. So I live in New York City, as you know, and the election happens, and the next day it was like nothing happened. Meaning no one was talking about it. Yeah. No one was upset. No one was angry. People just walking their dogs, doing their hobbies, running their errands. And I thought, oh, this is great. And I think one of the things is that there was a decisive result. Like we didn't have to sit for days wondering who was going to win. And we called it around 2:20 a.m. That's pretty good, because last cycle in 2020, we didn't call the election until Saturday.
Right. Yeah, I think that having a decisive election helped a lot with that. But I also think that a lot of people were mad because they believed what the media that they were listening to told them. And if you only watch The View or some of these other shows, you're like, well, of course she's going to win. I had people down here telling me, down in South Florida, how can anybody possibly vote for her? Certainly nobody. What do you mean it's tied? There's no way it's tied.
No, I had the same.
Yeah. And so I said, well, you need to get out to other places where it's not like it is down here. But that is a problem, because people only watched or listened to things that they agreed with. When the outcome didn't go their way, they were shocked and mad. And I think that's a real problem. Going back to what we talked about, not only listening to one source, is you assume, well, this is how it's going to be. And when it doesn't happen, you're crushed. And so it's really, really important to look at more than one source.
What are the big issues and projects you're working on right now in your world?
What the new regulatory structure will look like. There's a lot of things. That's one of the problems with, like, for example, ending the filibuster. It doesn't allow for durability of legislation. And so you see, remember President Obama said, I have a pen and a phone, and he did a lot of what he did through regulation. Trump was able to overturn a lot of that. And Biden and his administration also did a lot of that, where they did a lot through regulatory structure or through executive orders. Of course, Trump's going to undo most of that. So if you're in the industry, the main thing you want is stability. You want to know what rules to follow. And I think that's the pendulum of that is a real problem right now. And people are starting to figure out where they need to position themselves and how they need to be ready for upcoming regulation.
Right, and they want to invest and they want to grow their businesses, but they want to know that they'll be able to be secure in that. So, Don Stewart, thanks for doing the postmortem with me, but not just that, but to looking ahead just a little bit. I love your analysis, and I adore you. And happy Veterans Day to you, and thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Listen ad-free with a Fox News Podcast Plus subscription on Apple Podcasts, and Amazon Prime members can listen to this show ad-free on the Amazon Music app.